Hello? Yes, sorry. So welcome everyone. I'm Nic Terrenato. I'm the director of the Kelsey Museum. And on behalf of myself and of Michael Lottie, the director of the Anthropological Archaeology Museum, we are delighted to welcome you to an evening with the 5 projects that have been sponsored by a generous gift by alum Steve Klinsky, who is here and will say a few words in a minute. I just want to say how wonderful it is to have the entire archaeological community come together for these events, sitting at the same table, exchanges ideas and methods, and and sort of collaborating in community engagement and all sorts of different ways. So this is really, I think, a step in the right direction, and a step that could not have been taken without the generosity of Steve Klinsky, who should be ready to say a few words.
Great. Nic, can you hear me and see me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, I'm only going to speak for a minute. Thanks. It's a great pleasure to be involved with all of you on these expeditions. I grew up in Michigan, in Southfield and Birmingham. I'm an alumni University of Michigan. Also, have always liked archaeology. Even as a kid, I used to read a lot about archaeology, and I'm a big history buff. So the idea of helping the school by helping some great archaeological expeditions, both for what those expeditions can do themselves, the techniques they can pioneer, and hopefully just to build support in general from the broader community for University of Michigan and for archaeology is a great pleasure for me and my family to be supporting. So thank you all, and I'm going to go off camera and mute, and I look forward to listening to the presentations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Klinsky. I am Will Pestle. I'm the director of the education department at the Kelsey Museum, and I will be moderating this panel, which is the last of this academic year's Digging Deeper lectures. I know some of you have been in attendance throughout the year. Over the next hour and 15, we hope to not just give you insights into the specifics of the 5 incredibly varied Klinsky Expeditions, but also to offer basically a peek under the hood, if you will, of archaeology as it's practiced in the 21st century. To bring everybody up to speed, to begin, we've asked each of the 5 Klinsky PIs to give us a brief intro, gentlemen, to their project, and then we'll move on to the panel portion of the discussion. So going alphabetically by last name, we start with Geoff Emberling. Geoff is a research scientist at the Kelsey Museum. He's a lecturer in the Middle Eastern Studies Department and the founding director of the Center for Community Archaeology and Heritage. Geoff.
All right. Thanks, Nic. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Steve. We actually were given 2 to 3 minutes, okay? So bear with us here. Okay. Jebel Barkal is a site on the Nile River in northern Sudan. Whoop, okay. It's been known for over 200 years now for its royal pyramids and its temples and palaces, shown here, all of which show that it was first the southernmost outpost of the Egyptian Empire of the New Kingdom, think Ramses II, and then the capital of the empire of a culture called Kush. Kush conquered Egypt, where it ruled as its 25th dynasty around 700 BCE, and continued to rule for over 1,000 years while being in contact with Egypt, Greece, and finally the Roman Empire. Our work at Jebel Barkal has been to start to understand the broader town that must have surrounded these royal structures, but which nobody had ever investigated systematically. We're focusing on an area of the site called the East Mound, there you see it, up against the palm trees, which has shown some evidence of having been part of the ancient city. It's a strange time to be doing archaeological work in Sudan because there's been a war raging in the country for the last 2 years, and it is impossible for anyone outside Sudan to travel there. Fortunately, our project has been built as a collaborative research project, and we were able to continue our excavation this year with an all Sudanese staff, which has the additional benefit that we are supporting our colleagues in a time of real hardship for them and their families. Our project is also built around engagement with the local community, and local outreach will also continue as a part of our very generous support from Steve Klinsky. We have a lot of plans for our work this year, and we're looking forward to sharing them, and I'm sure that I'm over with my 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. In the words of Monty Python, now for something completely different. Next up, Bryan Miller, who's an assistant professor of Central Asian art and archaeology in the History of Art Department and assistant curator of Asian archaeology in the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. One of our Bryans.
Thank you, Will. I just want to say it's an extreme honor to be part of this panel, to be here, to have the support of Steve Klinsky in just really, really galvanizing the kind of research that all of us are involved. There's 5 people up here at this table, but a lot of the people from students to other scholars are involved in all these projects, and it's really amazing to have this opportunity. So very quickly, my 2 to 3 minutes. The project that our group is involved in is really about looking to places and to peoples that are never part of history. They're sort of seen as the dark matter of history. They're up there, they're far away from the Silk Roads, as you see mapped out on here. And then the dots, these are the kind of sites where we're gonna be working. So to start off, to sort of ground everybody, the concept of the Silk Roads is the dominating narrative for all of Eurasia, for pre-modern Eurasia, how things went across. In the center, you have, at the site of Tilla Tepe, you have all these big elite burials with tons of gold and all this stuff. So clearly there are very powerful elites right in the center of the continent. And the site of Begram, which is also part of the same region, has all these varied materials, stuff from China, lacquered cups, mirrors, everything else, Roman glass cups, intricately painted, intricately carved bone and ivory pieces coming from South Asia, what is now India. So all these things are conglomerating here. But the problem is that the Silk Road narratives only looks at this tiny little lens. And what we want to do is stretch it out. Rather than focusing our attention on this tiny little set of narrow corridors, we can't look just at corridors. We have to look at whole regions, which is why what we're going to be doing is looking up in here. And at the site of Lebedievka, which is very close to the sites that we're going to be working at, we find the same things that you're finding in Silk Road sites. Roman glass bowls and cups painted intricately with gladiators, mirrors coming from the Han Chinese Empire. All this stuff is coming up there, which begs the question, what is happening? How is it getting up there? Is this a fluke? Or are there whole sets of not just Silk Roads, but steppe routes? And I've highlighted the rivers as a reminder of there are all these different kinds of major highways that can occur. And that's what we want to look at. So our project is going to be going to places like Tashkopa, which has had a lot of recent excavations at it. Here you just see a mound. It seems very unassuming on the surface. No big towering columns or anything else, but there it is. But underneath, all of these, what they're called kurgans, across Central Asia, have underneath them the interments of local elites who are decked out, as you see from Taksai, recent excavations, all these kinds of things. And the things that they all share is this intricate vocabulary of so-called animal art in these little bits of gold and everything. But it's not just all these sort of different accoutrements that qualify a common vocabulary. It's the kinds of things coming out of the graves that we're going to be looking at. So the first project that we're going to get into this summer is analyzing this pot that was recently excavated by our colleague Arman Bisimbaeva. And the whole idea of what this project is doing is it's spanning from, the pure humanities, from looking at sort of art history, zoomorphic images, handles turned into horses, which is a huge part of the economy, but also then taking residues from here. You can see some of the little bits. And our group, led by Dr. Alicia Ventresca Miller, is doing the kinds of work where you can take these residues and figure out what was being in the pot. You can, if the preservation is good enough, you can get down to blood versus milk versus anything else, sheep versus goat versus yak versus horse. So we have the whole spectrum of different types of methods that we're going to be employing. And it wouldn't be a full archaeological project if we didn't talk about the ways in which we're taking all the kinds of things we're doing and applying it to the museums we have here and to education and to school group trips. So we're going to be looking at a mirror from the Kelsey Museum, which was found here, that seems at first glance to be, a Chinese mirror, but it's not exactly something that you would find from here, which we have examples in the art museum here. There's something strange happening here where they're producing local stuff. They're making imitations. So this brings up the whole thing of transcontinental trade, the issues of consumption, production, local imitations, demands, supplies, all these kinds of things that sort of come up with the issues of Silk Roads that we will talk about, but we want to take it further north into these areas that are considered marginal and the people that are marginalized and bring them to the fore. And lastly, if the clicker will work. An archaeological project, even though we have 5 people up here, is part of a huge collaboration. And so I have to recognize our local collaborator, Arman Bisimbayeva, and the co-PI, Alicia Ventresca Miller. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Next up, John O'Shea, who is a curator of Great Lakes Archaeology at the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology and a professor in the Department of Anthropology. Excuse me, John.
Thank you. You may be surprised to know that one of the earliest examples of human hunting architecture in the globe occurs right here in Michigan, under Lake Huron. And that's the starting point for the research that we're hoping to conduct under this Klinsky Award. The story begins with the end of the Ice Age and the melting of the continental glaciers. And as a result of this, the levels of water in the Huron Basin and the Great Lakes generally fluctuate wildly. And there's one particular time period that's particularly interesting, and that's the Lake Stanley stage, which is about a 4,000-year period, when the waters are more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Now, because of that, a huge amount of land was available for human occupation that we can't see now. And there were a number of really very interesting features out there. This is the Alpena Amberley Ridge. This is where the hunting structures are found. They were placed there specifically to intercept migrating caribou that were coming back and forth on this. And we found a number of really surprising things out here. But one of the more surprising things was the find of obsidian. That's dragon glass for Games of Thrones people. And this obsidian actually came from Central Oregon. So 9,000 years ago, these simple hunter-gatherers had exchange networks that stretched on a continental scale. Now, having said that, we're going to look at sites that are more than 1,000 years earlier than those hunting structures. And these are the sites that are associated with early Lake Stanley. And as you can see, there's much more of the lake bottom exposed here. There's less constraint on animal movement. The climate is slightly cooler, so we can expect that the human adaptation is going to be somewhat different. And in fact, one of the mysteries that we hope to unravel out here is why on land we find these large fluted bifaces, whereas underwater we find these very small, finely made small tool assemblages. And the question is logically, do these represent different technological foci? Are these different functions? Or might they be actually different people? So, the challenge of working on early Lake Stanley's landform is that the water continues to rise. And because of that, 2 things happen. The earliest sites are in the deepest water. The other thing that happens is sites that are on near shore that go underwater tend to have a mantle of sand over the top. So we need to devise methods that will let us find these deeper water sites and find sites that are potentially buried. On the other hand, the archaeological potential of this landscape is tremendous. We know, for example, that there are these deep water caves and rock shelters. We get glimpses of these very large stone structures, which may be the earliest fish traps in the continent. And we can prove that, in fact, you really do have stratified sites out here. This is an acoustic diagram, and you can see these layers. These are stratified layers of peat, which are a wonderful source of environmental DNA. And we can also tell where people were making stone tools, because it turns out the debris from making stone tools, the chips and flakes, resonate at acoustic frequencies and produce these distortion patterns. So we can pinpoint where these sites are for further identification. So if I were to put this in really simple terms, the goal of this research is to present a compelling picture of a uniquely preserved landscape and culture that we've really never seen before. Thanks.
If you think those things are old, we're going to. Next up is Bryan Stewart, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and a curator of African archaeology in the Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. Bryan.
Okay, I've got 55 slides, so we're going to need to get started. I thought you said 3 to 4 hours. I didn't. So just to echo the thanks to you, Will, and to Nic, and of course to Steve and his family for their generosity. My project, or our project, my team's project, is really trying to redress the kind of astonishing fact that we still don't know where our species evolved, Homo sapiens evolved. It's an incredible thing. You'd think by now we would have an idea. We have a better idea than we did in the 90s, but we still don't know. And so we're going to try to help resolve this. We have no pretense that we're going to definitely resolve this entire thing. There's obviously many people working on this, but I think we can make a pretty good stab at it, and I'm going to hopefully try to tell you why. Just to give you some context, there was a very large debate in the 80s about where in the world we became Homo sapiens. There were two sort of schools of thought. There was this idea that maybe there were previous species that had come out of Africa and moved into parts of the old world, and that through gene flow, basically, they had maintained connectivity with one another, and Homo sapiens had arisen in different parts of the old world sort of at the same sort of time. And there's this kind of multi-regional idea of human evolution. A very prominent a person who advocated that was actually at the University of Michigan. That was contrasted with an idea that we are a Africa-specific species and that we arose in Africa and then came out of Africa and replaced or interbred with those previous hominin dispersal descendants. That was put to bed in the 90s with the advent of high-resolution DNA. Africa won that particular battle, largely. There was integration, we know, but we are an African species. We know that now. We have the most, Africa has the most mutated, just meaning the oldest genetic lineages, whether it's mitochondrial or Y chromosome or nuclear in the world, give rise to all the other folks of the world. And this, we know this from modern, especially hunter-gatherer people in the continent. We now have good fossil evidence. I'm trying to click this and nothing's happening. Towards that. That's why it's not working. We have good fossil evidence that this took place around 300,000 years ago now in Africa. That. I'll never get there, Will. I will never get there. But we still have no idea where within Africa this took place. There's a continuum of ideas about this. One is, and this has become the prominence sort of in the early 2000s, that there was a single African origin. This ranges in size from a large region to a very small little corner. Probably the most extreme version of this is this idea that we evolved in a little tiny corner of the subcontinent of southern Africa around 200 or so thousand years ago. And at the other extreme is this kind of African version of multi-regionalism, right? So instead of old world multi-regionalism, it's all over Africa. again, through populations that had maintained genetic connectivity over tens of thousands of years, arising sort of simultaneously, and that better can explain the incredible fossil diversity of early Homo sapiens. And there is an enormous amount of diversity. So there's this African multi-regional idea. The problem with trying to solve which one of these is true is that the last 10,000 years has seen unbelievably dynamic population movements in Africa itself. Africa today is a very different place than it was 10,000 years ago. So by using living people and their genetics to try to address this, it's been extraordinarily challenging, and there's all sorts of problems. And so what we need is ancient DNA drawn out of materials that are in the archaeological record to help us try to identify this. The problem with that is Africa is hot, and DNA doesn't like hot. Ancient DNA hates hot and does not preserve particularly well. And that is a serious and very simplistic but very, very serious problem in subtropical and tropical environments. You'll notice that Africa is the largest landmass to span the tropics in the world. But Africa has mountains, and we like mountains. I work in the mountains of Africa, and there's other mountains in Africa too. The Atlas Mountains, the highlands of Ethiopia, and where I work down here in the corner in Lesotho. Africa also has a large amount of latitudinal diversity. It's not only subtropical, you also have these areas to the far south and the far north where you can try to get at some of these potentialities. And so we're targeting a series of sites in Morocco and Algeria, on the Ethiopian plateau, which it doesn't exist. Oh, sorry. First, in South Africa and Lesotho, these are a series of sites that I've been working on and others of colleagues. And then another series of sites on the Ethiopian plateau, which eventually will come up here in the far east of the continent. So we're going to look at areas that have had very little work done on them in terms of ancient DNA, trying to leverage the kind of preservational conditions that we hope will be more conducive, but also, and this is one of the more interesting components of the project, taking advantage of very recent methodological innovations in ancient DNA, especially the extraction of ancient DNA from jewelry, which was done for the very first time in an Upper Paleolithic context just a year before last in 2023. And we've got we have the oldest jewelry and ornaments in the world in Africa. And then extracting it from cave sediments, and not just any cave sediment, but from micromorphological blocks. So these are blocks extracted from stratigraphy, impregnated with resin, and cut into thin sections where you can control the taphonomic conditions under which those biomolecules accumulated to a much greater degree than just pulling it out of the sediments, where there's all sorts of issues in terms of where those, what are the actual biomolecules you're trying to understand actually came from. So this is what we're going to be doing, working with colleagues at the Max Planck, at Harvard, at Flinders University in Australia. Thank you so much.
Last, surely not least, is David Stone, who is a lecturer in the Department of Classical Studies and who first took me to the field as an archaeologist almost 30 years ago. 30 years next year. So.
Thank you very much, Will. I remember it well. So I would like to begin with thanks to Steve Klinsky and his family for supporting this work, and to Nic Terrenato for facilitating everything for us. Okay, several important battle sites have been discovered recently. Too many to list here. Some have been found with satellite imagery, others by consulting local residents about artifacts or even skeletons they have found in their fields. Our project aims to find a new battle site dating from the period of the Punic Wars fought between Rome and its most formidable adversary, Carthage, between 264 and 146 BCE. If there were ever a point when the rise of Rome could have been arrested, and we might look to ancient history for models of an oligarchy rather than a republic or an empire, this would have been it. Okay, We're particularly interested in the Second Punic War, when the Carthaginian general Hannibal led his army from Spain across the Alps and into Italy, often turning towns Rome had recently conquered into allies or devastating landscapes under cultivation. Hannibal fought Rome in a series of pitched battles in Spain at Baecula and Saguntum, in Italy at Lake Trasimene and Cannae, before the Roman general Scipio Africanus led an army to Africa, forcing Hannibal to return home. There, Scipio defeated Hannibal somewhere near Zama in 202 BCE. The goal of this project is not only to find a battle site like Zama, Trasimene, or Cannae, but also to do the scientific analyses that will inform us about the ordinary people who fought in the Roman and Carthaginian armies. Were they from Italy, Carthage, or hired mercenaries from other places? What injuries did they suffer? What can we say about their diets, their health, and their stature? What weapons did they use? Where did the metals for their weapons originate? Will the surviving remains help us to understand battle strategies? The project hopes to blend public interest in a fascinating historical era with challenging detective work in bioarchaeology, in geophysics, and in other fields to produce results that will capture the attention of both public and scientific communities. It's just a coincidence that our project is taking place at the same time as a movie about Hannibal starring Denzel Washington is being made. But hopefully it's not going to hurt either. Okay, that's that.
It's fantastic. See what I was saying about varied, right? A couple 100,000 years, 3 or 4 continents, depending on how we count. I mean, it's a pretty incredible array of projects answering really fascinating questions. And so I think that's where I want to start. And the format here for you all is I'll talk with our panelists for a little bit and then be thinking of your own questions, because we'll throw the floor open and ask them to sing for their supper tonight. So I guess where I want to start is why? I mean, why was this the question? Why is this the angle that you decided to take? Is this a question that's been lingering in the back of your head for years? Is this just sort of the next step, the natural evolution of work that you've been doing? I mean, what drove you to it? Why does it animate you? Why is this the way that you've chosen to go when given sort of the whole world to play with? And I don't know if any of you want to step up and go first, otherwise I'll call on a particular name. So, Bryan, yeah, please.
Can you hear me? Okay. For me, it has to do with these different ideas of a single origin versus a multi-regional origin for Homo sapiens evolution are rooted in demography ultimately and connectivity, social connectivity, right? A multi-regional origin, which is much more realistic, I think, on an African scale, still enormous, second largest continent. It's a giant place. So it's kind of hard to imagine even that, but that entails a degree of social connectivity, which is quite extraordinary. It means that gene flow is managed through people moving around and being in touch with each other. And Homo sapiens are the social hominin, the social force in this world par excellence. I mean, obviously gotten into trouble many times. And so the story is not simply about where within Africa or how within Africa, but also what that says about deeper processes of sociality, but also of the accumulation of what's called a cumulative culture, right? The ability to learn and to store up a necessary amount of survival information that no single individual could ever have by themselves, but that's what culture is for, and we've harnessed our culture to an incredible end to become the great sort of plastic ecosystem engineers that we are.
I mean, Geoff, I might throw to you. I mean, why are we looking for, the town, right? When we have the temples, we have the pyramids.
Sure. I got 3 answers for you all. So one of them is, since my dissertation, I've always been interested in trying to get toward the experience of people who lived in the past. And I think you really get that when you look at urban life. You understand what people ate, you understand who their neighbors were, you understand how the social dynamics, both class and different forms of identities, all came together in a city. So moving beyond the temples and the palaces gives us a way to look at that in Kush. Secondly, this is probably the least broadly interesting, but it's really compelling to me, is a scholarly comparative study of how cities function differently in Africa, in African context, than they do in the cultures that we know more about from the ancient world. And they were different. They were less dense, and they interacted with broader areas of hinterlands than the cities of Mesopotamia, for example. And then finally, there's a sense that Kush, as the earliest empire of sub-Saharan Africa, has not got its due in scholarship, in popular imagination, and in a way, this is very basic research. We're just trying to document something that we know a lot about for other cultures, but Kush and Sudan have not got their due. So those are my three answers.
Fantastic. And I mean, I think, David, this gets to some similar themes that you mentioned, right? This idea of sort of documenting and understanding the individual experience of soldiers, right? So moving beyond the high-level picture with historical documents and really digging into the lived experiences there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the project is interested in the lives of the average people in history. The other 99%, maybe we would call them. And I think gone are the days where we investigated public centers to see what temples were like. Now the questions are about individuals, right? And I think this really reflects a lot about who we are as people and how we see ourselves today. So we're interested in individuals and what they did in their own lives and their private lives too. So yeah, thank you.
No. And I mean, I think to bridge from that, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed in reading your proposals and speaking with you all is that I think all of these projects have the potential to really challenge some widely held and sometimes kind of pernicious assumptions about people of the past, maybe, and of the present too. And I mean, I guess I would ask what bits of kind of common knowledge, right, does your work potentially have the capability to debunk? And maybe Bryan Miller, start with you, because I know that's sort of the setup to the punchline of your work, right?
Yeah, I mean, to pick up on the thread that Geoff was talking about, a lot of the things that those of us who work in regions not in the classic, cradles of civilization kind of areas, we're doing the real foundational work. And even though my early research when I was a student was in the first Chinese empire, I very quickly shifted to the first Mongolian empire, because this presented me with a case study of it doesn't operate the way we think states should operate. It doesn't operate the way empires should be. Here it is, a massive empire. We can see the footprint. We can see the impact of it. But the primary economy is geared toward pastoralism. That's the basis of their economy. They add agriculture and all this other stuff, but they're not obeying by the rules, which means that we have to look back at our assumptions, our models of everything, and say, there are, as Geoff was saying, there are many different alternate ways that any sort of like trajectories of social complexity, economic complexity, all those other kinds of things can happen. So I think from the beginning, that drew me into Mongolia. And now that I've finished a whole book about the first empire of Mongolia, I'm kind of shifting into other parts saying, besides just looking at those cradles of civilization, and then people slowly started to move up into the Silk Roads, and they thought that was the fringe. That's only the center. There's a whole world, all of Siberia, all of the steppe, that is just sort of deemed as, out there beyond the pale. But clearly by sites such as Lebedevka, we can see they were involved in all these networks. And what our project is trying to do is say, they weren't just involved. They weren't just like passive purveyors. They were actually driving the consumption. They were driving what moved, how it moved, what got from one end to the other. And they were really important peoples in transcontinental trade from the very, very beginning.
No, and I think in speaking about networks, I mean, I think, John, your work, I mean, the idea that societies that have oftentimes been considered as being, sort of small and maybe not isolated, but, not interconnected to the degree that obsidian from the Pacific Northwest showing up in Michigan would suggest. I mean, it really is, a fascinating, again, sort of pushback against some traditional narratives. I don't know if you want to expand upon that.
Well, sure. People tend to underestimate what people in simpler societies were actually capable of doing, and whether you're talking about the networks that moved obsidian around, and it's very interesting to try to wrap your mind around what those networks might have looked like. But equally, how did they move these boulders? I mean, how did they do any of these things? And it's sort of like, who built Stonehenge? How could they possibly have built Stonehenge? It must have been aliens, right? I mean, it's this kind of underestimation of the abilities of relatively simple societies with relatively simple technologies to actually accomplish very, very complex things. And I think that's one of the themes that comes out of a lot of our archaeological research.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you mentioned a word that, again, I think cross-cuts a number of the projects here, which is technology. So maybe we'll stick with you to start us off on that topic. I mean, a number of these projects, maybe all of them, use some really cutting-edge modern scientific and remote sensing and geophysical techniques. And so, I mean, I think I'd be interested to hear you sort of, I mean, perhaps discuss some of the technologies you're using and maybe what they reflect about the nature of archaeology today and our, the changing abilities that we have to perhaps reconstruct past human behavior.
Well, like a couple other members of this panel, I've been doing archaeology for a long time. And I've done it with strings and line levels. And the ability of technology now to change how we do the very fundamental things we do as archaeologists is really amazing. And then the crossovers with the natural sciences and the biological sciences, it's causing us to finally be able to test some of these theories that we've had forever, like Bryan's work with the DNA. For me though, the neat appeal is the technology itself. I mean, it's something different than we normally do as archaeologists, but being able to really learn acoustics and being able to really learn some of these other techniques and what you can actually discover with them is one of the things that keeps the whole work fresh. And it pushes the frontier, and each of these new lines of technology causes you to then reevaluate everything else you know. It rebalances the scale. And I think for me as an archaeologist, that's what keeps it really interesting too.
Yeah. No, and Bryan, since John name-checked you, I'm going to ask you. I have to say, even the first time that I read your proposal, it wasn't absolutely clear to me what DNA you were looking for on adornment. I mean, I initially assumed that you were looking at the DNA of the animal's tooth or, the ostrich eggshell. But, I mean, maybe walk people through that really, bleeding edge kind of part of ancient DNA analysis and, adorn DNA on adornments.
Yeah, and the disclaimer is I'm not a geneticist, so I'm leaving this up to the
else in
experts
this
at the
room
Max
is-
Planck.
yeah.
Yeah, there's very few people in the world who can do the things that I talked about in the last slide. They're brand new techniques. The DNA amplification in general has become extraordinarily sophisticated, and that's allowed the tiniest little, really tiny little microscopic, smaller than a sand grain, shreds of DNA to be amplified and segments of the genome to be decoded effectively. And with the jewelry, what we're talking about is skin cells, effectively, that have rubbed off on these things as they were worn. The nice thing also is that ancient people often used body creams, and some of those body creams very commonly had antimicrobial properties. So manganese and red ochre, hematite, are antimicrobial, and so that aids in the preservation of the DNA. And that was the key to the success of the Upper Paleolithic case study. And a lot of the beads that we have in Africa are totally caked in ochre, covered in ochre. The aperture is where you would expect the skin cells to preserve, are often full of ochre, plugged with ochre. So I think we're quite confident, and hopefully a big problem with DNA is contamination from ourselves, right? And so these have been excavated, they've been handled, and that is a problem. But if we have ochre plugs in some of these apertures of these beads, we can hopefully extract them and be confident that we're getting ancient biomolecules instead of modern ones. The sediments, and then I'll stop talking. The sediments from rock shelters and caves have a much wider range of problems associated with them, and that's why taking a sediment sample out taking a block of sediment out of an excavated section, impregnating it with resin, and going in a very targeted way and pulling out DNA. We know exactly where it's coming from because the amplification technique has gotten that good. It allows us to be much more confident about where, the history of what we're actually looking at. Because as you say, those sediments are made up of all sorts of different biomolecules, right? There's all the animals and birds and fungus and all the things that contributed to those cave sediments that are biological are going to wind up in that sediment sample. So we're looking obviously for the humans, but of course these things are also dynamic, and sediments themselves can move up and down through caves. And so by looking at the burial context in a very microscopic way and being very careful about that, and the field of geoarchaeology, geological archaeology, has become very sophisticated at doing that. We can target areas that have had relatively little dynamism and movement, and that we can be confident that we're looking at ancient human DNA.
Yeah. Geoff, I saw your hand went.
Yeah, I just wanted to partly issue a little bit of a disclaimer. I mean, the closer you get to the cutting edge, the more risky it is, right? I mean, and you just don't know. So we're actually digging in Sudan right now. Our team is, at least the Sudanese members of our team are digging. And so if any of you want to go on our website, Jebel Barkal Archaeological Project, we're posting over the next week or two. We'll be continuing to post. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a little story about a different kind of risk. We had wanted to do thermal imaging from a drone. So you can fly a drone over and get differences in temperature, particularly at sunrise and sunset, which would have been really potentially interesting for us to identify where the cemetery of this ancient city was and to excavate it. That would have been great. But it's a war zone. Thermal imaging is also night vision. So there's a military component to this that we hadn't worked out. But there's another problem. In Sudan, the army and the militia are fighting against each other. The militia has been bombing with drones the electrical infrastructure near the site that we're working at on a regular basis. And so we, without knowing quite what we were wading into while we were doing this dig, we got permission from the local security services to send a regular drone up just to take some pictures of our dig, a totally standard thing that all archaeologists do now. We got a 1 hour window where we could fly it, and we didn't know until it was too late that what this entailed was they were turning off their anti-drone defenses for us to take some pictures. And during that hour, somebody who was in the neighboring town actually sent a drone to attack the dam electrical power plant. So anyway, that's just, I mean, there are many ways that technologies can fail. That's one where ours has failed even before it got started.
Wow, yeah. I mean, just to tie this off, I think, another technology about which people have perhaps divided opinions right now is AI. And I know, David, you're talking about perhaps employing some artificial intelligence to aid in the search for this battlefield. Can you maybe, again, talk to people about how exactly that would work, how exactly you're going to employ and train an AI to do some of the grunt work for you?
Okay, right. So I got really interested when a friend told me that they have sites that they know about, and they want to check whether or not they've been looted. But they have so many sites that they can't, with people, go and look at these sites day after day after day. So they take pictures of these sites with the satellite images of the sites, and they train the AI to know what the site normally looks like, and then to just analyze the images of that site to check for looting all the time. So I thought that maybe we could train the AI to find characteristics in the landscapes near where we think these battlefields might have taken place. And so at Zama, for instance, we know where Zama is in the modern town, but we know that the battle took place a day's march from Zama, so we don't know exactly where the battle was. But I thought if we could use AI to investigate the landscape and look for what camps might look like, or even what mass graves might look like where we have identified those, then maybe we could get a sense of where that battle site might be located. So that's the idea behind that.
No, it's fascinating. I don't know if everybody in the room knows, but the challenge that was issued to the proponents to the Klinsky Fund here was to propose a moonshot, right? To propose something that was, otherwise unobtainable, right? Or something that was, I don't want to say speculative, but something that was, had risk, and that might not have been supported by traditional funding mechanisms, may they rest in peace. John, maybe I know you in particular, I remember it's even in the title of your proposal there. Talk about the moonshottiness of this. What did this generous funding allow you to do that you couldn't otherwise? What challenges did it help you overcome? Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad you asked me that question, since it is in the title of my proposal. And if I'd have had 30 more seconds for my presentation, there was a final slide that I had to cut out that actually had a definition of what a moonshot is. And a moonshot is something that promises to be innovative, challenging, but it won't necessarily produce results right away. And I have to say, and I didn't have an acknowledgement to Mr. Klinsky in my talk, but I'd like to do that now. One of the amazing things about this award is it allows us to take risks. It allows us to enter into that realm of high risk but high potential payoff that you simply can't get funded anymore. Quite honestly, the research I described in this talk was submitted to NSF. And NSF said, this is a great plan, this is a great project, but since you don't have the sites already, we can't fund it. So even the normal funding agencies, when they're working, aren't going to fund research that's high risk, high potential payoff. And I think every one of these talks you've heard tonight is exactly that kind. And there's nothing that can replace that. This is the only source I'm aware of that would actually support this kind of research. So again, thank you, Mr. Klinsky.
Does anybody else feel like answering the moonshot question, or did John tie such a nice bow on it that we can? Okay, all right, we're moving on. Very good. So something that definitely has payoff, look at that transition, is the educational component of this. So again, something that the audience might not know is that as part of the funding, Mr. Klinsky, the Klinsky family asked that each of these 5 projects include a K-12 educational component, right? So the idea here wasn't just that the archaeological community could benefit from this work, but that there would be a tangible benefit for kids in our schools across Michigan and more broadly. So I think it'd be great to hear from you. Maybe start with Bryan Miller there. Tell us about what in your ideal world, what would you like K-12 students to learn from this work? What would you like them to do with that knowledge, right? How would you like them to apply it?
I think one of the neatest things, and I know we've been talking about what to do with these things. The original proposal was, well, we have to stick with the standard Michigan curriculum of this and that, and I know you said, can you do something with the Silk Roads? And my answer was immediately, actually, you can do something with the Silk Roads. There's that mirror. I've been staring at that for several years now, thinking it's listed as a Chinese mirror, but I know Chinese mirrors. That is not a Chinese mirror. What is up with that? And so it just really sprung forth all these ideas, and it made me think that's a really great way to help, from grade school all the way through college, students to really engage. The idea that you can have one single object that can then explode in a whole long story, because objects have their own lives. Yeah. Their commissioning, their creation, they get buried in the ground, they get taken out of the ground again, and suddenly have a whole new life. That's one of the things that we're looking at for that pot, where, again, picking up what you were saying, Bryan, about these methods that are here, now suddenly they're shifting over. At one point, Alicia Ventresca Miller and Chevin Wilkin were talking about all the stuff they do. You scrape the plaque off the teeth and you can see what they're eating. And then there was that moment that they thought, wait a minute, anything bronze touches that's organic, it preserves quite well. what if we scrape the inside of a bronze cauldron? And sure enough, the recent papers have been just exploding this whole new field. So it's really about like pivoting and thinking what you can do. And so I think the thing that we talked about is, what can we do to like take that bronze mirror and really like look at it and walk the students through, like, well, what is it made of? How do you know it was made locally? What's the idea of like recipes for metallurgy? And you can have this whole suite of things that is both talking about science and metallurgy, but like trade, interaction. You can touch on modern themes, which is the easiest way to really like get into like explaining it, like the idea of, you know, a fake Gucci bag that ends up in New York. Like these are the kinds of things that you can really talk about to them and think like these kinds of dynamics were happening all across the world in much more like way ancient kind of time periods. And when John showed the slide of, you know, transcontinental trade, I'm like, yes, there it is again. So I think that if you give them an object, and I know we talked about making 3D copies of it, so that the students could hold it in their hand, hold this mirror, hold that mirror, and actually see and compare them themselves, and go through the critical thinking process on their own, I think is a big thing to help them understand.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fantastic. And I think one of the things that I know in the education department we're really excited about is, and these projects are an ideal embodiment of it, is that there are just so many ways by which one can access archaeology, right? So if you come from, you know, an art historical background, if you come from a biological science background, you know, geochemical, you know, marine science, you name it, right? These all can speak to these archaeological themes, and I think that we can, you know, engage the imagination, you know, harness the excitement of kids who have just a wide array of interests, and, you know, bring them to archaeology, and then, you know, have that feedback, as you suggest, to sort of help develop some of those critical thinking skills. Geoff, I saw that you had your hand up subtly.
Yeah, so we're my friend and colleague Tahami Abul Ghassem is the one who's running the dig in Sudan, and the way we're running this as a collaborative project is he's sending me WhatsApp messages every day, me and my colleague Tim, who's in Denmark, and they're photos of what they're digging, and I mean, this is like, it's such a perfect encapsulation of the archaeological process. And, you know, oh, what's that? What do you think it means? What should we do next? And I think you know, so we're planning we're hoping to be able to do another field season in the fall. Mm-hmm. And I think just looping kids into that process would just grab them, you know? Yeah. Even if it's not treasure, which is another way to grab kids, of course, when it's beautiful objects. But it's definitely the actual daily process of archaeology. And the other part that I would definitely want to weave into it, you know, many of us in this room have anthropological training, and many others of us are interested in culture. It's also to weave in something about the experience of working and living in another place. Yeah. That's so important to me. Yeah. And so easy enough to weave in, oh, here's what we had for breakfast, and you know, those sorts of things. So we haven't discussed this, but I got it all ready. All
right, awesome. Look forward. I mean, we've discussed really similar things with you, Bryan Stewart, that, you know, this idea that using, you know, an arts curriculum, right, to look at, you know, the manufacture of these ostrich eggshell beads, you know, to have, you know, itty bitties, right? To have third graders, second graders, first graders, right, actually manufacturing ostrich eggshell beads or facsimiles thereof, but then to maybe walk people through the second step, this idea of the beads as social currency, and sort of how to, and again, appreciating the cultural context of these things, that they weren't just pretty to wear, they were pretty to do things with.
Yeah. I mean, they're ostrich eggshell beads begin to be manufactured across Africa, not just Africa, but also southern parts of Asia, China, southern China, India. But in Africa, have the deepest sort of lineage of these artifacts, going back 50,000 years, and they sort of became the kind of main social currency. They were exchanged. We know over hundreds, almost certainly thousands of kilometers, probably not entirely dissimilar to the kind of obsidian distances that John was showing, although it's harder to track the ostrich eggshell than it is the obsidian. I really love this idea of kids making these, because they're really hard to make. They're hard, and they're tiny, and they're strung on these strands, and there's like thousands per strand, and it takes hours to make one little of these tiny things. And so these things, represent, yes, they are worn for aesthetical purposes, but they are primarily worn because they show what other people think about you. They show how much you are loved and appreciated, and they're a direct reflection of your social network. They also have supernatural, ontological, religious significance as well, because ostriches are very powerful birds in a lot of hunter-gatherer societies in Africa. And so, yeah, I mean, sort of showing kids the care that goes into artifacts that were then given away, that were then exchanged. You know, I sort of have this very cheap line that ostrich eggshell beads are like, you know, Facebook likes, which now, of course, no kids understand because nobody's on Facebook anymore. Is there an Instagram version? I need an Instagram version. But anyway, yeah, it's a cool curriculum. And the other nice thing is that ostrich eggshell is basically calcium carbonate, and so if you breathe it in, it's not going to hurt you. Which is important.
Yeah, no, we don't want to hurt any of the students, to be sure. So, as you might have guessed by the microphone strategically placed over there, we'd welcome any questions from any of you. You know, the archaeologists can talk among themselves, obviously, but it would be great to hear questions from anybody on any of these. Otherwise, we can carry on with our conversation. Any questions from the audience might want answering? They don't bite. They seem really friendly. I don't know if you've noticed, they've been laughing and giving you all the social cues that suggest that they're... Well, so in the absence of questions, we'll continue. So you've received this funding. It's obviously, you know, it's allowing you to do things that... Oh, wait, a question from the audience. Let's, please, come on on. Come on down. I got to say it. There we go. Yeah.
Thanks to all of you for a fascinating overview of these projects, and thanks to Steve Klinsky for... Whoops. Okay, thanks again to all of you for the fascinating overview of your projects, and to Steve Klinsky for funding such a fascinating slate of projects. And we heard a fascinating little anecdote from Geoff about how these conflicts that, you know, are these people who decide that we're going to do these things, they all happen way above our heads, and they affect our own lives. And we heard about how this affects your work and in the village. And so, Dave, you're also working on conflict, right? And I'm really curious, you know, when we teach Latin at Michigan, we read Caesar with the students, and, you know, we have this great insight into Caesar saying, yeah, I went to France and I killed all these people. But you actually have this opportunity now to tell us about those people, not in France, but in Northern Africa, who died in these wars that were, again, decided over their heads, and they were forced in these situations they didn't want to be in. So I guess I'm just kind of wondering what kinds of things you'd like to be able to learn about these people.
Okay, thank you, Theo, for that question. So we have some assumptions about who the Carthaginians were, and those assumptions, they come from people like Roman authors who slandered them, who said that they were terrible people who sacrificed their babies, okay? And this presents them as a kind of cultural monolith of baby killers. I don't think that's accurate, but I'd also, you know, we may not be able to say that they're not baby killers, but I think we can say that they're not all the same people, okay? That they're not this monolithic Carthaginian type, but maybe they're from, you know, some of them are from North Africa, some of them are from Sicily or Sardinia or other places, and they're just different as people, and maybe some of them are hired mercenaries too. So that's one answer that I think, you know, gets at your question of maybe overturning some assumptions that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dave.
I mean, sorry, Geoff, did you have a follow-on to that? Oh, sorry, okay. I imagine that you know, despite having received this funding and being able to take steps that you know, you might not otherwise have been able to take, that challenges still remain, right? I mean, this is not you know, the silver bullet, right? That's going to solve all of the problems. So I mean, give us a little sort of, you know, take us inside your heads. What's the thing, archaeologically at least, that keeps you up at night? I'm not going to ask more broadly. You know, what? Anybody?
Archaeologists, like many other humans, tend to be rather territorial. And I didn't dig all those sites that are represented by those little dots. And so gaining access, because a lot of times, you know, I mean, well, surely most of the time, archaeology is excavated and then it's placed usually into museums or universities where it's curated. You don't need to ask the person that excavated it to have access to it to do analyses on it, but it's nice to do that. So I'm very much hoping for open collaborations, but of course these are politically challenging relationships often, competing teams for small pots of money often, and because we don't often have Steve Klinskys around, and so yes, so access is for me is a key issue, but taking steps to address that in addition to the contamination issues that I already mentioned, which are serious as well.
Sure. Yeah, John, please.
If I could follow on with that, I mean, I think the other thing that may come through with the talks you heard today is that these are not short, sudden answers immediately come to the fore. And I think all of us, we're talking about long-term processes of research, and certainly for the work that I've done in Lake Huron, the lake gives up its data very, very grudgingly, and it is inherently a long-term project, and it has to be. And I think if you talk about what I stay awake at night about, it's having to stop, and it's having to stop before we've found at least a good stopping point, or at least a provisional answer that we can live with. And I think that's really what keeps me up at night, because I know what that process looks like, and it would be a shame to have it just stop.
Yeah.
Question.
Hi everyone, it's nice to see you from the front of the room. So Geoff, you were able to tell us like real life, like daily updates we're getting. I'm curious for the other panelists, how often will we as the public be able to get updates? And like, how soon will we know how your moonshot is going? And I know that for some people that might be more difficult or not, but yeah, I would just be really curious.
I'm interested to see the situation in the local towns and the places we're going to be in Kazakhstan. After spending most of my career working in Mongolia, you are not going to get WhatsApp updates where we are. Yes, it just doesn't exist. So it's a very different kind of feeling. It's kind of nice to unplug and go out there. But I think a lot of the issue to get kind of into the community archaeology thing that Geoff Emberling and Tiffany Fryer have started here at Michigan is it has a lot to do with the way you engage with the local communities and the way you involve them, but also we are delving into their heritage. And so what can we do? There's the excavation process itself, but then there's, after you leave, what are you doing? So a lot of the work that we've been doing in Mongolia is going back to these communities, like not during dig season, but in the so-called off season, to like come back in and like talk to local communities. How do we like help galvanize their local curriculum? I think the thing that I know everybody on our project in northern Mongolia was thinking was, here we are in far, far north Mongolia. We're excavating, cemeteries that probably relate to the descendants of Genghis Khan himself. It's still quite like jarring for us to think that that's what we're dealing with. But to have some of the interviewers going around like talking to local communities and what do you think about this? And they say, yeah, Genghis Khan, he's important. He did something, yeah. We're like, wait, we're in Mongolia. What? And so it makes you rethink everything that you're doing. Like, how do we engage with that? How do we help? And at a certain point, you have to dig, whatever, but just like all the involvements with school groups here, we have to have a dedicated amount of energy to how do we get involved with, school kids there. So I don't know if this is sort of somewhat of a tangent, but yeah.
No, but it was also another question I wanted to ask. So it's answering all of my questions.
And I think there's, to put together John's answer and yours, that relationship building and that trust building with the communities takes time too, right? I can remember, it's only in year 5, 6, 8, 10 of, field work in Puerto Rico that some of the folks I work with actually would then tell me where sites were that they knew about once they knew that I wasn't, going to be there one day and gone the next, right? So you've got to build those relationships. And I know that, a number of you have been working in these regions for a long time, perhaps your entire careers, but it really is, yeah, I think it's, going to be hopefully the beginning of long-term commitments to the work, or continuations in some cases of long-term commitments to these regions. So, David, yeah, sorry.
Yes, so, Will, I think one thing I'd like to say is that we would like to work with you to publicize our stuff on Kelsey Museum social media sites or other areas. And I think this can be a learning experience for students. I've worked with students before on this who thought they could put pictures of anything up there. They had to learn what was permissible in the place we were working to report and what wasn't permissible to report. But I think that's a good experience for students and all. And so, to answer the question about when we can learn, I mean, we'd like to work with you to put together something so that there can be regular updates in the social media channels that already exist.
Jeff, and then we'll
Just
go
a
to
very, very quick follow-up. We've had an interesting argument, actually, about putting up how much immediacy do you give to these kind of reports? And are you comfortable with saying what actually happens, which is that you have a lot of ideas that are wrong? It happens on a daily basis, and it's a lot of it is coming from me, honestly.
watch us dig a lot of dry holes, right? Yeah, no,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, I think that's a riverbed. No, it's not a riverbed. Anyway.
As long as it's not aliens, I'm sure it's fine.
Maybe get more press if it were aliens. So yeah, another question from the audience.
Hi. So you guys each have talked a lot about how your projects can educate K to 12, but acknowledging that I'm currently like a student rounding out her first year, I'm curious to hear how any or all of you see your projects as sort of goals for your current students or people you mentor, or what you want your students to take away from the opportunity you have.
Training, fieldwork, analysis. Don't be so polite. Somebody start talking into a microphone.
Just really quickly to jump back again to all the stuff that Geoff and Tiffany started with this new community thing is we are at a cusp where we can do better. We can have stuff for, K through 12 groups here. We can have like more involved engagements, not just, we sit down and we have a cup of tea with them every once in a while. They are part of the process because these are local communities across the entire globe. And I think that sort of like real nitty-gritty of archaeology and how you do it, I think is a way to move forward, I think.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, in terms of graduate students, I think one of the traditions at Michigan is that graduate students work on projects other than their own. I mean, there was a time when I could say honestly that our graduate students would typically have worked on 2 or 3 continents before they completed their dissertation work, and the students working on each other's projects as well as on professors' projects. And I think that's a goal that's worth doing, and the diversity of the work that's expressed even with this panel suggests the kind of potentials for graduate students particularly being involved in using the skills they already have on some of these different kinds of projects, whether it's the actual field work, whether it's analyzing the data downstream, whether it's doing some of the technology. But I think this is a general characteristic of the Michigan training in archaeology that you probably won't get in a lot of other places.
Okay, so thank you very much for that question. So one thing I want to say is that for me, working at the University of Michigan, one of the things that I really like best about my job is the students at the University of Michigan. And so, and I think everybody probably feels that up here, that we really encourage students to work with us in the field and really enjoy that. And so find a project that interests you, students out there in the audience, and come up and approach one of us. As Will said before, we're pretty well trained, I guess, and somewhat socially adjusted. So you can talk to us. Okay.
I would also just add that obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg for any of these projects. So there's probably a lot of opportunity if the broad subject is interesting to you. I mean, like, I can't offer an opportunity for anyone to go into the field. That would not be responsible. But there's a wide range beyond just field work. So yeah.
Nicola looks like she's itching to ask a question right there. I could see.
Thanks for reading my mind, Will. This has been such a rare pleasure to see these projects put together. And I've been thinking, as I've been listening, about the way in which we get so siloed within our academic disciplines, and the way that this breaks that down in a wonderful way, and the threads that are kind of exposed as we sit in conversation together. And so I was wondering about mechanisms for bringing the excitement of that to a wider audience beyond this room. I wondered what your sort of, ideal would be, your moonshot for that, if you like, like a Netflix series, or, if you could do anything to bring the excitement of this to a wider audience, what would you do? Thanks
You
so
think
much.
you're joking, but
And yet.
I mean, given the quality of most programming on archaeology, the bar is pretty low. So I think we can do a great deal. A Netflix documentary is actually a really good idea. It'd be novel having like actual archaeologists do it, or at least acting in good faith. No, but seriously, I think publicizing the work is enormously important. Archaeologists are, weirdly enough, because we have, obviously we're massively biased, but it's interesting. It's just across the board. From Stephen Klinsky to most people I talk about, you never meet somebody who's like, archaeology, oh my God, I can't believe I'm stuck in this. It is, even if the archaeologist is boring, it's still, but archaeologists tend to not be great at professional archaeologists tend to be not great at getting their results across to the broader public. So I think this is actually a really good opportunity to try to redress that a little bit, given that this is an unusual circumstance. As you said, the projects are very diverse. They have threads between them, even if they're incredibly diverse. I think we should really put our heads together to try to do that. It's a really good idea. Yeah. What form that would take, I do not know. Netflix is actually the best thing that I can think of right now.
All right, so we're almost out of time. So last time I gave you 2 to 3 minutes, and some of you took 3 to 7. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds each. All right, so we're back here. I want you to all close your eyes and visualize now. We're back here 5 years from now, right? And we're doing this again. What does the next step look like? What's kind of the ideal result, and what would come next if if this works, if this moonshot succeeds? And you don't all have to answer, but if anybody can think, I know some of you are thinking about next steps after this. Nobody. Wow. Okay, I was wrong. So I could have sworn. Oh, sorry. We do have a question from the audience. I apologize. Think about it while he's asking a question.
It was a good question. I didn't want to give.
No, that's all right. Yeah, no.
So I'm a middle school teacher that's trying to connect the kids to all these subjects, some of you specifically already, and trying to flood you with qualified graduate students hopefully soon. But one of the things, I try to introduce them to actual papers so they see what it's like. But one of the things that's been most profound with the kids is connecting like just the intimacy of the past. And I think you guys worded that well before, that people were more sophisticated than is often interpreted. So I'm wondering, for any of you, what is something that you saw in your research that made a, you're obviously trained professionals, but you almost kind of let your guard down a little bit, and the intimacy of the past kind of hit you? One example I can think of is I talked with Dr. Ian Hodder before at Stanford that heads up the Çatalhöyük project, and I told him the thing that hit my kids the most out of one of his lectures was seeing a woman buried and just embracing a plastered skull and asking them what it's like. And he said that was the exact same thing for me. That really hit and just traveled through 10,000 years of history like you knew that person. So I was just wondering, in all of your research and everything, if there is something like that. With Dr. Emberling, with your video I show with the kids, one thing, especially my kids back when I taught in Wayne, that they loved was your excitement that the collapsed roof perhaps could have some robbers under it. And they got a kick out of that. But any of you, is there anything that really traveled through that time?
Those moments where it's a specific moment and a specific person that make that kind of connection, I think are actually relatively rare. I mean, we're more often looking at kind of broader processes. So I'm looking at the development and growth and decline of a city. So like, it's hard to pick out a biographical moment in that. I mean, that's the whole goal of my project, really, is to allow us to imagine ourselves, being a cattle herder in Sudan and slaughtering your cow and doing, that kind of thing, or being a farmer or being a trader, So it's a long process to get to the point that you can reach the imagination of a middle school student. But I mean, that's, for me anyway, that's the goal of what I'm trying to do, is allow us to think back. I mean, I can tell I think we all have moments in our career where we found kind of that event, but that's really the exception. And I wouldn't want to build you can't build an archaeological research project hoping to find, that kind of dramatic moment.
To come off your question and to think about my 30 seconds of things, I think especially since our project is working at burial grounds, we are unearthing and bringing to light whole sets of individual peoples, and therefore the communities. So it is this interesting, bridge and spectrum from individual lives that they led, and the people who come and give ostrich shell, bead necklaces, they make offerings of their own herd, they do all these things. But then you have, on the other hand, large, big, broad narratives that people like to talk about. How can the stuff we do, if I 5 years from now thought about it, all the stuff that we're doing in these parts of the world that are just seen, out there in the margins, that our better understandings of those will radically change the way we think about huge, broad historical narratives, from very narrow focused on this one temple or this one civilization, whatever, to complexify it, if I had to put it that way. But,
I'm not going to talk about the next 5 years.
Okay, that's fine.
But in answer to your question, it's not always just the evocativeness of something in the record. I mean, I've done a lot of work with funerary practices and looking at the systematics to it. And there's this amazing feeling you get when you suddenly break the code. You've been working on an analytical problem, and suddenly the pieces fall in place, and you suddenly feel like, I know what these people 4,000 years ago were doing. And it's an amazing high when that happens. And I tell the students in class that when they have that experience, their job for the next 2 days is trying to destroy that. Prove that it's wrong. And then after 2 days, if it's still okay, you've actually accomplished something. But there's an intellectual side to this beyond just the material stuff that is really awe-inspiring.
So, unfortunately, we have reached that hour. It is 7:30, and we do need to wind down. Just a couple of thank yous before we do. Obviously, all want to thank Steve Klinsky and the Klinsky family for their generosity in supporting these endeavors. I want to thank Nic Terrenato and Mike Galati from Kelsey and Uma, respectively, for their stewardship and leadership in these efforts. I want to thank the education staff at the Kelsey, Shannon Ness, and Stephanie Halley in particular, for all of the hard work in putting tonight's event together. And last but surely not least, all of you for attending. Thank you so much, and stay tuned. Thanks. Have a good evening.